Hello, everybody. We're so happy to have you here today. Welcome to our Ask the Expert series. If you are new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's live question and answer topic, we'll be discussing the importance of clinical data, including sources of data, literature searches, weighting and appraisal, and effective presentation in your CER or PER. Our first presenter today is Lori Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she's a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is also a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Our second presenter today is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Principal Medical Writer with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. And now I will welcome Lori to give an overview of today's session.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. This is going to be a 45-minute long live question and answers session. We've got a lot of questions already queued up from the registration, and we're looking forward to the questions that you also provide in the question and answer box as a part of this webinar. So if you have any questions on how to generate, collect, analyze, assess clinical data pertaining to your IVD or medical device, or wondering what are the best practices for conducting literature searches, or how to effectively present your data in your CER or PER. This is a webinar where we hope you'll get some great insights and tips and more information on how to do that. So without further ado, let's get started.
All right, let's get to our first question. Lori and Sarah, let me know when you can see the question on your screen.
We can see it.
Okay, our first question today is, how do you best collect and present data on similar or competitor devices?
So I'll start. We wanted to actually put this question up as a starting point to clarify something. This is the use of the word, of the descriptor or the adjective similar versus equivalent versus competitor. So we all know what the subject device is. I think that's a clear term. That is your device, the device under evaluation in either the PER or the CER. But let's just make some distinctions about similar. Now, MDR in a couple of sections does use the word similar, and it is meant to also be another word or another way to say competitor. Our recommendation for all of you is to kind of drop that word similar, because to a lot of us, we're not sure if you mean similar as in equivalent or similar as in competitor, because it sort of could be used both ways. So I just want to say that when you're asking questions or you're even writing something, avoid the word similar and say exactly what the device is. Is it the subject device? Is it an equivalent device? Or is it a competitor device? And then there's no gray area about that. That's why we wanted to put that up there first. But Sarah, With regards to the question itself, how best to collect and present data, and I'm going to say here that on the competitor devices, I'll let you weigh in on that.
Yes, so this will be a really critical section of your SOA or the state-of-the-art section. You're going to want to plan on conducting multiple systematic literature reviews. Your goal is to identify high-quality data sets that will present on the safety and performance criteria that you've identified that you want to use to assess how your device compares to your competitors or the competitor landscape. So you're going to have these various systematic literature reviews. You're going to have to collect those articles and those data sets from within that systematic literature review, and then identify what are going to be some of these key safety and performance indicators that you're going to then present. So it will require sort of a very organized template and a strategy on how you're going to not only identify those articles and make sure that your search is conducted properly so that you're capturing these data sets, but also then how you're going to appraise them and present the data to ultimately arrive at your acceptance criteria. That's going to be a really key endpoint for your SOA section. You want to identify what are the acceptance criteria by which you're going to then later describe and assess your own device based on.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And here's our next question asking about best practices for appraising literature and clinical data. And if you could please give some examples.
So I know that Sarah is probably keen to answer this question because we at Criterion Edge take the entire CER or PER writing extremely seriously. But amongst that, the methodology used for the searching, screening, reviewing, appraising, and weighting of data, both competitor and subject device data, is, in our opinion, one of the low-hanging fruits of the notified body review, because it's data, and those data are used ultimately to answer the question in the CER or PER, which is your device safe and perform as intended, based upon data. So the notified bodies zero in very heavily on your documentation of your literature, searching, screening, reviewing, and appraising and weighting. So without further ado, I'll let Sarah build on those thoughts with this question.
Yes, thank you. So the appraisal plan, really, its role is to help you demonstrate that you've thoroughly examined the methods that have been used to actually generate the data that you're presenting, but also that you're evaluating whether or not that data that's being reported in any given study could have been potentially influenced or somehow affected by the design of the study itself. So you want to have an appraisal plan that allows you to determine the quality and the scientific validity of each individual data set. And then that's going to help you determine the relevance to your clinical performance so that you can really truly weigh the relative contributions of each data set as part of your overall evaluation. So as you're sort of setting out to begin this whole process, we use the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, or the IMDRF guidelines, in order to use our appraisal criteria. So you'll basically, by using these criteria, it appraises the suitability of any given article based on whether or not the appropriate IVD was being used. Oh yes, I see that in the chat. I'll make sure I put that acronym in the chat for everyone. So you want to make sure that in terms of identifying whether or not your article is suitable, did they use the appropriate medical device or IVD? Was it applied properly? Like, did they use it under the correct indications or in the most appropriate patient group? And then also, how was the data actually reported or collated? There could be something in some cases, like let's say they provide a percentage, but they don't actually provide the information about the total number of devices used. If you don't have the total number, but you only have a percentage. So there could be some sort of slight variations in the way and some heterogeneity in the way the data is reported. So that's really where that appraisal criteria and having your appraisal table included at the end is going to be really critical. You're also going to want to look at sort of the study design itself and the different types of outcome measures, or even things like the follow-up period, whether or not there were different time points collected. And then eventually you're going to also want to describe the level of evidence to really sort of analyze the criteria for each individual data set. So the level of evidence is going to help you weigh whether or not, like for instance, in a level 1, that's going to state that you have data on the subject device, what your actual subject device is. It's used as intended in the correct patient group. The study designs were appropriate, or they had minimal deficiencies in the way the data was presented, and that there was an appropriate follow-up period. So you're going to ultimately weigh level 1 evidence more highly compared to level 2, where maybe it was used in an off-label purpose, or in a slightly different or more limited patient group. Maybe you were only looking at like women versus men, or smokers versus non-smokers. You know, if there's a very specific targeted patient group at play, that's not to say that that data isn't still useful and couldn't be incorporated in your analysis. By all means, you can, if it's a relevant article that's been screened, but by including these analysis criteria, it allows the notified body to have a true understanding of what are the overall levels of evidence that you're presenting.
So Sarah, I want to jump in there too. You said so many important things. I'm going to say that there's, to kind of summarize, there's weighting of the evidence and there's appraisal of the data set. Those are two different undertakings using two different tools. And the IMDRF that she referred to as an appraisal, validated appraisal tool, and the level of evidence. And Sarah, you know, kind of put something in there about the level of evidence tool that we use and is commonly used. If you've got a summarization of a name for that. So those are two different undertakings. Another important thing that I was thinking of when Sarah was explaining, especially when she talked about level of evidence, and she was saying that L1, the level 1, is the most applicable data. It has the highest level of evidence because it has direct applicability to the subject device, the data set, the indications for use, and so forth. So another way of saying that is that manufacturer held data on your own device is almost always level 1 evidence. It's the highest level of evidence because clearly if you're going to conduct a clinical trial or collect data on your own device, you will be, it will be directly applicable to your device. So something to think about out there in a broader scope, which is as you are preparing for your devices to be MDR certified or your analytes in your IVD world to be IVDR certified, do you have your own data on your device? Manufacturer held data is the most valuable data. So this is a broader call to action within companies to be thinking about how are you going to collect data on your own device if you haven't done that already. So that's my 2 cents at the end of that call. There's a lot to unpack in that, but there's almost nothing more important than data and the strength of the data, the sufficiency of the data, and does the data cover on the subject device, cover all indications, all patient populations, all clinical conditions, and all time periods. So these are all important things. So next question.
All right, here's our next question, and probably a good follow-up to the last one. What are the best strategies to collect data for a new product?
Well, I can start with the obvious, and I'll let Sarah jump in. The obvious answer to that is you conduct your own clinical investigation. There's the best strategy to collect data for a new product, and I assume a new product means, in this case, it means before it has received CE mark, is conduct your own clinical trials or clinical investigations on that. That's the best way. On the post-approval side, which is after it's already gained CE mark under IVDR eventually, and certainly under MDR, and then there's a variety of ways to collect data in the post-market follow-up. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sarah?
Really, you're kind of looking at several different pools of potential data. And so in the case of a new product, you can still conduct literature searches to identify whether or not there's a similar technology or either a competitor or one of those equivalent devices. So maybe your product is new, but there is an equivalent device that your company also has data on that has been published more extensively. If you can establish equivalence, you could use the literature searches to identify previously published data on that equivalent device. But for a new product, that's where you're going to really be pulling from some of your internal clinical investigations or any sort of internally held data sets. But you'll still have to conduct those literature searches in order to identify who your alternative technologies are and who your competitor technologies are with regard to that product.
But there's also the collection of data in the post-market arena, which in that case then would be continued literature searches, or again, the most powerful data is manufacturer-held data. And what is manufacturer-held data in the post-market? And that is your passive collection of post-market surveillance and complaint data. Those are safety data. And then, and I know this is a hot topic for everybody, which is your PMCF, post-market clinical follow-up, or post-market performance follow-up. That is the proactive plan and collection of data by the manufacturer in the post-market space. So that is a big focus of that ongoing proactive collection of data to feed into your evaluation process that then feeds back in to your quality management and risk management systems and keeps a continuous loop of updated information derived from post-market collection of data on your device.
Yes, that clinical experience data is
Yes.
incredibly useful, and it's weighed very heavily because it does allow you to identify some of those less common but still potentially serious adverse events, and also could provide some of that more long-term information about safety and performance or efficacy. So if you're going to use your clinical experience data, making sure that you have reports or presentations of that data that allow the notified body to undertake sort of a more objective and a rational assessment of that information, that's going to be really critical. And that kind of ties into the importance of having solid templates and organized reporting methodology.
Great questions so far, everyone.
All right, moving on to our next question here. Can clinical evidence from previous CERs be applied to RBA updates, or must a new literature search be done?
Sarah, you want to take that?
So in this case, you definitely will want to include your previous data from previous CERs. It's expected that you will. You wouldn't just sort of discount everything that's been published in your or described in your previous CERs. But at the same time, you should be conducting ongoing, should have a method in place to continue to conduct these literature searches with regard to the risk-benefit analysis. This needs to be a process. It's not going to be just a one-and-done kind of approach. So it's expected that you're going to have a system in place to allow you to continue to reassess whether or not the risks and the benefits have been, whether or not they've changed since the previous CER.
So the RBA stands for risk benefit analysis. So risk and benefits updates. So remember that the this is almost the only thing that's important in a CER at the end of the day, and a PER, is to establish the safety and performance as intended of the device, and to link those data and those conclusions back to your internal risk benefit management system, so that there is this continuous loop. So this is it's an ongoing, you must demonstrate in your CER or PER that this is an ongoing process. So new literature searches are done with for every evaluation period, which is most common these days. Is that really in the medical device space, the frequency of these clinical evaluations is really landing at the 1 year mark. Some are 2 years. We haven't encountered any that where the frequency is greater than 2 years. So yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, here's our next question. Do you have a sample checklist that details the steps for conducting a proper literature search?
Well, sure we do. We have that internally, that's for sure. We have a whole SOP and a process for the steps of conducting a proper literature search from beginning to end. And I'll let Sarah weigh in a little bit more on the methodology, but I would point everyone back to MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4, where it is it's like phase, I think 1 or 2, where it's describing the systematic literature review process. And that the description within MedDev is really what MDR and IVDR point at when they say, we want you to do your lit searches like that. That's how we want you to do it. So any other further comments on that, Sarah?
Yes, I'm putting the acronym in the chat box here right now. So there is a guidance that's been put out that provides what they call a possible format for the literature search report. Mm-hmm. So there isn't a one size fits all search report template that you're expected to use, but you should include all of the same methodology. They want to see that your literature search is methodologically sound, that it's robust, that it's reproducible, and that it's transparent how you conducted the search, and then also how you appraised and identified which literature have been included and excluded. Yeah. So you're expected to have a solid search strategy in place first and foremost. Once you identify the articles in that long list, you want to make sure that you have a strategy for including or excluding the articles based on relevance. And when you exclude a particular article, you have to have a legitimate reason for excluding it. So this is where being organized and having sort of a system in place for these identifying early on these inclusion and exclusion criteria and identifying the proper search strings to use is going to be so incredibly important. If you don't have the proper search design, you may wind up with thousands of articles that you still are expected to screen, and that can take a really long time. So having a very well targeted search strategy, but then also an organized approach to the screening itself. And then you'll present this in a Prisma format to explain sort of how your entire search was conducted and what are the how many articles were excluded at the title level or the abstract level or something to that effect.
The question was, and maybe Sarah, could you type in MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4 for everyone's in the chat box? For everyone's.
Okay, oh yes, it should be just above, let's see, I have one that describes, it's that MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4. And then the one article that's specific to the literature search strategy is the one that I posted just below that, where it's the
Okay,
IMDRF. They detail it pretty well in their Appendix B. And Appendix C provides sort of an example of what a PRISMA would really look like. But yeah, this process, it's definitely, it can be daunting, and organization and is really critical for having a strategy in place.
One last thing before we move on to our next question is this, and this is a little bit of the bad news here. For those of you that still think that you can get a CER or a PER across the finish line and the notified body review by doing an internet-only search, PubMed, Google Scholar, it's not going to happen. They will come right back to you and say you can't do it. You can't do your search that way. I think I'm going to be very plain spoken here. They are looking for a sophisticated mesh terminology search protocol and search strategy, which is published in the CER. And for that, to use that the internet can't support that, you'd have to use some sort of other platform to get to the ability to input that sophisticated search strategy, which has usually anywhere from 15 to 25 to 50 steps in it. Look, using Boolean search terms and all kinds of other search terms. And we use ProQuest Dialog as our platform, and ProQuest Dialog specifically searches many databases, has access to over 300. But again, MedDev calls out that you must search Embase and Medline minimally. So all of that are requirements of MDR, and I'm sure it will be the same in the IVD space as well. So if you don't have access to that, you should try to begin to locate a way to get those searches done in that way. Librarian and a platform to use it in. Those are my thoughts there. So next question.
Okay, our next question is, how do you clarify the information for safety and performance metrics versus risks and benefits for medical devices?
Sarah?
So this is an area that we regularly encounter confusion with. The safety and performance metrics are going to be well reported. They're pieces of data that are clearly reported and used to make a comparison between competitor devices and your device. So you're going to use these to help you establish the competitive landscape. The risks and benefits are going to definitely be informed by the safety and performance criteria, but they're going to kind of go a step further, because in the risk and benefit analyses, you also want to take into account sort of the other alternative technologies out there. So it kind of ties back to that state-of-the-art section. The clinical benefit is going to describe the impact of the device on the health of the individual in terms of these meaningful, measurable, patient-relevant clinical outcomes. So those are your some of your performance criteria, whether or not it increases or decreases your time to ambulation after a particular procedure. Does it reduce your risk of infection? Those types of things are clinical benefits. They might not be easily reported, but you would certainly describe them and include them. So these will be supported, the clinical benefits are going to be supported by your safety and performance metrics. But you can also include evidence from preclinical testing or bench test data to show that you're complying with current standards or clinical guidelines. You could also include data from registries or information from different database records, or data from another device that's often used in conjunction with the subject device, which may not have direct, if your subject device may not have direct clinical data associated with it.
So that was all about risks and benefits there, I think, Sarah, right?
Yeah,
Which is
yeah.
much different than the safety and performance objectives that are established at the very beginning of the CER or PER. And from those safety and performance objectives of the subject device that you've identified, then you turn to your competitor device literature to extract from the competitor data the acceptance criteria of those safety and performance objectives that you identified. So this is almost like bookending this process. What is one of the first things that you'll do when you start your CER? Virtually the first thing is you establish the quantifiable safety and performance objectives for your subject device. And it doesn't need to be a lot. It can sometimes it's only been one of each, one safety, one performance. More commonly, it might be one or two or even three of each, and that's it. And that's something you do right out of the gate. Like when we engage with our clients, it's the first thing we ask, because the second thing we do is start the literature searches, and we need to know what data are we looking for, right? When we're reviewing the subject device data articles and the competitor device articles. So think of safety and performance, one of the first things that you're going to need to determine right out of the gate. One of the last things that you're going to do then in the CER or PER is loop back to your risk and benefit internal management files. And you're now going to say, okay, we've done this entire evaluation. We started with the state of the art. We've shown you all of our literature searches. We've done the subject device literature searches. We've compiled all the data on the subject device and all the claims and all the benefits and all the risks as a part of this evaluation process. And we just reported on all that. Now, at the very end, we're going to say, okay, at the beginning, all up till now, we've told you everything we found out in this evaluation process. Now, in this risk benefit section, we're going to summarize what are the benefits and the claims that the company publishes on their device, and did we find any data that supports the benefits and the claims? In other words, if you say you have a device that does something within the first hour, it will do something. I'm just making that up. Did you find data that actually supports that quantifiable, it does something in the first hour? Yes, we found that in article XYZ. We found that in, clinical investigation data ABC. In other words, you're supporting it. And you do that for all the benefits. And then for the risks part in that next to the last section of the evaluation report, in the risks, you say, did we identify any new risks or increased evidence of known risks in our evaluation process of all the data? So risks, benefits at the very end, and you're looping that all back in, and you're telling the notified body reviewer, we've identified all these things as a part of this evaluation. And we're telling you now, notified body reviewer, that we're going to include and loop all of this now data that we've derived back into our internal QMS system, risk benefits system. QMS stands for quality management system, and into your risk benefit analysis internally. And that's the loop that they're looking for. They're looking for, what did you learn out of your evaluation of your device? And what are you going to do about it? And that's what they want to see. That's what the difference is with the risks and benefits. It's one of the, in our opinion, it's the second most important section of the CER or PER, second only to this state of the art and scientific validity or state of the art, which is where you do the other part. You identify the safety and performance and the acceptance criteria. So these are like bookends. What do you do at the beginning? And then how do you finish at the end? So I'll stop talking about that. I hope that helps a little bit. It's an important question.
Okay, we'll get to our next question here. Weighing data sets seems difficult due to heterogeneity of data from different sources. What is recommended? Is there any scheme?
Yes, so this will tie back to one of the additional guidances, that Appendix F that I've posted in the chat. So it's fully expected and anticipated that you're going to have heterogeneous data sets. That's to be expected. You're going to have some articles will be prospective cohorts, some will be retrospective, some may be randomized control trials. They will each be weighted independently. So it's not to say that you can't still use and report the data from each of these different cohorts. There are definitely, it's expected that you will include a variety of different types of studies. But when you're generating the scores, the clinical data will receive the highest weighting if they've been generated through a well-designed or a monitored randomized control trial, if they've been conducted with that device using its intended purpose, and if it's been evaluated in a particular patient cohort that are part of that target population. But in many cases, a randomized control trial may not be feasible or appropriate. So these alternative study designs, these cohorts or registries will still provide clinical information that's extremely relevant. It's just where you weight them within your weighting schematic that will help you basically distinguish between the study design so that it's clear how that study design could potentially impact the overall appraisal that's been given to each of the data sets. So I think it's important to keep in mind that each of these data sets will be weighted independently, and that will allow for that comparison.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. Can you speak to the level of evidence needed for Class 2A legacy devices with no clinical studies?
Sarah, I can take this and to say that this is a challenge. Legacy, we get a lot of questions about, that's all well and good for, for gathering data on, new devices or devices where there are a lot of clinical investigations or a lot of studies done. What do I do with the Class 2A legacy devices where nobody writes about them? We don't have any data on them. What the heck do we do with that? And so this is a very good question, because the person asking this question wants to know specifically about what level of evidence is needed in order to use data on these Class 2 legacy devices. So that's a very specific question and a great one. In our experience, writing many Class 2 CERs, MDR CERs, the notified bodies have consistently accepted lower levels of evidence on these lower class legacy devices. What does that mean? That means that if you're writing a CER on and I always use the guide, I always poke on the guide wire, but I always use that as a guide wire, a cardiac guide wire, or a coronary guide wire. Nobody writes about a coronary guide wire. Nobody does a study on those, except maybe internally in some clinical investigations internally, but certainly out in the post-market period. So how do you then gather year over year data on performance and safety data on your guide wire? Well, these are called, what you might need to do is create surrogate safety and performance objectives, which means in the case of a guide wire, let's say that this is a coronary guide wire, and the performance, how do you judge what's a performance objective for a coronary guide wire? You could use one surrogate objective that we have used successfully is procedural success, which is always reported. And most articles, when someone's doing a procedure in which they might list at the end of so the article is about something else completely different, maybe a new stent that they're using, but they'll note that they used your guide wire, for example. So, all right, so let's take procedural success as a surrogate performance objective for our guide wire, which can be then the logic, and you have to justify that logic, which is it's logical that if there was successful, if there was a 98% procedural success rate, that, and our guide wire was used in all of those, there's a 98% success rate for the performance of our guide wire in that n number of patients. So that's an example of choosing surrogate objectives for your legacy devices. In other words, you may not have direct data, but what other type of parameter or objective can you choose that through surrogacy will establish the safety and performance of your device? So, so one last question, one last thing. Those levels of evidence are much lower. So for example, let's take the guide wires suggestion again. We have also gone all the way down to case reports, which is the lowest level of evidence there is. And we've used that. Now, one last important point. You still need to go through the robust systematic literature review for the subject device and the competitor device to establish acceptance criteria. You still need to show the notified body that you did that, and that lo and behold, the only data we got back are these 15 case studies that were done, but at least we got that. All you need to show the notified body is we looked and we did a robust search, and this is all we found. That will at least check mark that box off of them. Well, they looked appropriately. I like their methodology. They have done a robust job of documenting it. Okay, you found what you found. That's another thing that you can argue back to the notified body, is that we found what we found, and this is it. So that's another, it gets down into a rabbit hole a little bit sometimes, but we can move on to the next question.
All right, here's our next question. Could you define device lifetime and address the clinical data needed to support device lifetime?
Sarah, you want to talk about that?
Yes, I can take this one. We actually received this question ahead of time. So we had a little bit of time to really do some digging and realize that this definitely is a topic that there's a little bit of confusion on. So MDR mentions device lifetime at least 11 times, but they don't really define what they mean. They do define what they don't mean. So it's not life expectancy of a device, or it's not the expiration of the device, or how long it's used. It's a new concept. So it's expected that you're going to need to determine your device's lifetime and explain how you've come to that conclusion. So there is one spot in the current guidelines where they state that the expected lifetime is to be defined during the design input phase by considering the current state of the art or a specific intended use and indication of a device. So it's something that should be supported by your state of the art section in terms of how you're defining the lifetime. And so the clinical data that you're collecting as part of your state of the art search and also your competitive landscape will help you to really have that input that you're going to need to define your own device lifetime.
I can give you one example of, thank you, Sarah, that's a great explanation. I can give you one example of device lifetime for a particular device and the justification for it. So this is an orthopedic device, and let's just say plates and screws, a system. What would be the device lifetime of a plate and screw system used to, stabilize a fracture? And what has been well accepted in by notified bodies is bone healing. Bone healing is the device lifetime. So in other words, once bone healing has been achieved, which is then you justify what had defined bone healing, and you justify with studies, bone healing is commonly looked at as like 9 months or 6 to 9 months. So then you justify that you choose bone healing as a 12-month mark. Now it's quantifiable. That's a objective. and a lifetime, you've justified it. Therefore, in your IFU and in your design files, you could then justify that that plate and screw could be removed with no harm to the patient at 12 months and beyond. That's device lifetime. In other words, they don't need that device anymore because bone healing has been achieved. Therefore, the plate and screw to stabilize the fracture is no longer needed and may be removed. That's an example of device lifetime. I want to give a shout out to someone who I just saw it out of the corner of my eye that posted from our last question where we were talking about safety and performance objectives and all of those data, that they gave a shout out when I was talking about legacy devices. They gave a shout out to, and make sure your PMCF data collection plan and data collection, if you have devices like that are lower level, make sure your PMCF plan and data collection supports your safety and performance objectives for your legacy devices. Because again, that's proactive manufacturer held data. It's one of the highest levels of evidence there are. So think about your legacy devices, think about where you're coming up short on your data and what are the key safety and performance objectives, and design your PMCF plan and data collection around that. Be the keeper of your own, collector and keeper of your own data.
Great, and I think that is a great place to end on. That's all the time that we have for today, and I hope we were able to answer most of your questions today, but if we weren't, you can go ahead and email us at consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again, Sarah and Lori and everyone again for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Take care, and we hope to see you next time.